Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our last presentation for the day. I'm about to add on Nick Sousanis, who is our guest speaker today. And there we go. So I will let Nick introduce himself and get right on with the presentation. But again, this is our last presentation of the day. And I thank you all for coming and everybody who stayed so far. Okay.
Thanks, Ramon.
Take it away.
Thanks, Ramon. Thanks for having me. Thanks for organizing. Let me hit the screen share and make sure it's working before I say any more. It'd be an odd talk if I can't show you any pictures. Are you seeing it? Looks like you are. Okay. So I'm Nick Sousanis. I'm a professor at San Francisco State University, where I run a comic studies program there. And I'm a comics maker and probably best known for doing my dissertation entirely as a comic book. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that to start, a little bit about thinking in comics and how I think about comics, and end by talking about my students and the kinds of things we do in class, and offer you some places if you want to teach or think about making comics yourself to start from. So to start, I was an early comics reader. I had my much older brother read comics to me, so comics was my first word, and I see the advantages of literacy in that. I see that in my teaching, and I see that in my own children now. And I made comics as a kid. I produced my own superhero comic when I was young, and but when I came to university, comics was just not a thing you can do, and I wanted to do intellectual things. And so I studied mathematics, which I'm pleased with, but I have this strange thing that's happened to me since then is people that study mathematics, they say, oh, you're so smart. And people who make art, they say, oh, you're so talented. And I think that division between the two, in my case, I think I was a very clever mathematician. I don't know how smart or not I was at it. I think my art, or people are far more talented, but my art makes me a lot smarter. So I think the goal in my work and the goal in my teaching is to kind of heal that rift and to show how those things aren't really so far apart, and we need people to see they can be both of them. So after this gap, I returned to making comics with some political comics around the 2004 presidential election. I shifted from sort of stories to talking about ideas in the form, made a comic about games shortly after that. And when I came to Columbia University, I just started making comics from the first day. I made a comic about my professor. I made comics about doing research or doing drawing. And then my dissertation, which is published as Unflattening, it's this bigger treatise on education and comics and thinking. And I'll just say a few words about it, but I was pushing back against this idea that I called flatness. And I didn't mean it in a literal way. I meant it as a sort of lack of possibilities. And because I had this word unflattening, I thought about, maybe a few of you are familiar with Edwin Abbott's 1880s novella Flatland, thing that moves. So this is a story about a world where everything is a geometric inhabitant. So there's squares and circles and triangles and lines, and they live on this infinite flat plane. And so they can move east and west and south and northwards, but they have no concept of upwards. They can't think of anything that's off their plane of existence. And you and I can look down on a flatlander and say, that's ridiculous. Of course there's upwards. But the question for me is, like, what are the things that we can't think about because we can't see them? And I saw education as a kind of flattening, as the sort of series of steps, a series of things that are done to us. And they're done in boxes, and our own thinking is put in boxes, so that if you're somebody who does art and math and also happen to have been a pro tennis player, they see it as really weird. And I think the boxes are what's really weird. And so as these things get lined up, I wanted to push back against that. Wanted to push back particularly against scholarship that looked like 12-point type, double space, 1 by 1 by 1 by 1.5 inch margins. It's not to say that's not good. It's to say, what else is possible? Why are we stuck with that system? What do we fail to see when we're only looking through one modality? And what might we make possible when we see through more? And I use the example of my dog in this, and to say that the dog's sense of smell, which we all know is stronger than yours and mine, is really significant because it's more nuanced, which means a dog can enter a space and have a sense of what was there a day ago, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, maybe a week ago, when we just can see things in a very different way. So the dog has access to this ways of understanding that, to me, is a kind of upwards. So the this is sort of the insanely fast version of unflattening, but to simplify it, it's to say, what happens when we don't just look through one eye, but we come through both? That allows us to have this expanded view of experience, and we don't have to just stop at two. And so for me, comics were this thing that not only that I loved to do as a child, but they were a way to be amphibious, to breathe in the worlds of both image and text, and maybe step out of some of my own limitations and start to see them for what they are and find some new spaces to be in. So I want to say some things about comics themselves and how I think about them, at least. We're in this golden moment here where, like, I have a comics program. We're having symposiums about comics. But it's like comics are this new thing. And yet, if we look at the sort of publishing history of comics, Richard Outcault's The Yellow Kid in the 1890s, which is often cited as the origin of comics in the United States, like that predates film. So comics have been around a while. And if we look at Rudolf Topfer, the Swiss artist, comics-like things in the 1830s, that's older still. And we can keep going back through time and look at illuminated manuscripts and tapestries and all kinds of things that exist that are pretty much like comics, even if you wouldn't call them that, all the way as old as things that made us us. And it's not to say that this cave drawing from Lascaux 30,000 years ago is a comic, but it is to say people have been trying to make sense of their experience through picture stories as long as we've been who we are. And so in the case of my work, I don't think it's so new that I'm pushing visual communication as significant. I think we've been talking about these things for 100, 150 years, but we tend to leave it as talk. We tend to not shift it to doing it in the form. And I think comics is something that enabled me to do that. And so if we talk about what comics are, it's always great, and I assume people listening into this are super familiar with this, so I won't dwell on it. But I think Scott McCloud's definition, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, is a really good starting point. So basically, if you're not familiar with it, I put my fist in a box here. I put my fist in a box here. Two static images. The reader turns them into something. Nothing actually happens, but the reader turns them into something. I think the most significant thing about this is that the passage of time is written in space. Again, comics don't move. Comics can't do any of that, but so they have to do it spatially. So here I've redrawn a Paleolithic calendar from about 30,000 years ago, showing the different phases of the moon. And how do people make sense of change over time like that? Well, they didn't have movies to make sense of it, but they did have flat surfaces that they could make marks on, and they could keep track of those marks. And I think I wrote it down here, observing events in time and graphically noting them in a spatial sequence is a fundamentally human thing. I'm not saying this is a comic book right there, but I am saying that kind of thinking, that how do we make sense of things in time is really fundamental to what we are, and I think fundamental to what kinds of literacies our students should have. So to continue on with what comics are, so yes, we read a page sequentially, left to right, top to bottom, in the ways that we read text. But because it's a visual thing, we can't help but start to make connections across the page, start to see the lower right connect back to the upper left, start to make connections in multiple directions, and even within the words and the pictures. So you might read here on my page rather associations that stretch web-like across the page, and you might notice there's a spider web there, and you might start to jump back and forth. So the comic book, rather than being sort of a linear or tree-like structure, is much more interrelated. All the pieces are connected in different ways, and the fancy word for that is a rhizome. It's rhizomatic, and I think comics are this sort of interesting mix. And so they handle time and how we experience time in this really interesting way, and that they're sequential, like we move through time. You went from one talk to the next, and you went to lunch, and you're going to go to something different. You move through time linearly, I assume. But at the same time, your thoughts are all over. They're happening. Something I say suggests something you're thinking about. You're remembering something earlier. You're anticipating something earlier. Those things are happening all at once. And I think the really cool thing about comics is that they allow you to have both of these modes, the sequential way we experience time, but also the all at once. So I really think, and it's strange in this time when our phones can do so much movement and stuff, but I think the static and flat nature of comics is really a superpower. It's a superpower because we can have all kinds of different connections going on, and we can care about comics in terms of both the individual drawings, but also the meta drawing that is the page. And this is a pretty neat page. If we were in person, I would wait till you laugh when you see what happens. But you can do some really weird things in comics. So this little guy in Andy Black's comic here is trying to get the fruit, and he can't reach it. He can't reach it, but he gets an idea, and so he walks back across the page and in a way that he can reach it. So it's a very unusual space. Marc-Antoine Mateu's comic about the Louvre. And if I showed this to you as 9 separate panels in a slideshow, you'd get most of it, but you'd miss this triangle or pyramid, which represents the Louvre, that's running through the whole page. So you're getting both the sequence and the simultaneous all at once. In Frank King's Gasoline Alley, he did this quite a bit. You see the characters sort of bumbling sequentially through the scene, but it's all at one single, all at once scene. And in fact, it's even weirder than that. Nobody usually notices this, but he keeps restarting at the left in a way that you're used to dealing with in sequence, but very strange if you think about what's actually happening. David Mazzucchelli talks about this directly in Asteria's Polyp. Simultaneity, the awareness of so much happening at once, is now the most salient aspect of contemporary life. And you can see it in his page. He's got sort of sequence, and then things start to collapse together as the page goes on. So comics really offer a lot of different kinds of possibilities, where again, you care about what goes on the individual panels, but the whole page itself has a life to it, and can, in the case of Winsor McCay here from about 100 and some years ago, becomes a character. In Young Avengers from maybe a decade or so ago, the panel becomes both the way of marking sequence, but it also becomes this, I don't exactly know, some sort of dimensional trap for the characters that they can break out of. And in Nina Paley's cartoon here, the panel borders become a psychological trap. So this mix of sequence and simultaneous allows all these different kinds of storytelling possibilities. And for me, it's not just we're adding words to pictures, but it really shifts the way that reading can happen. So in my comic here, it's about entropy, but it's about how things go against entropy. If entropy is things falling apart, running downhill, moments like life are where they go against that flow. So my page starts out in a linear way, left to right, left to right. It's going left and down. But then there's some things that ask you to read around this way. And then you go down, and then all of a sudden it asks you to read backwards, right to left, and then to read bottom to top, and then before you snake out of the page again. So comics not only integrate pictures into how we appreciate things, but they also change the very way that we read. And I think that's really significant. These are quick looks at how the page was made, but that's not so important. So I really like this from the cartoonist Seth, that rather than thinking about comics as prose and illustration, that we think about them as poetry plus graphic design. And thinking about that with my students, I really find liberates them from being worried about how well I can draw a nose, to thinking about how well can I organize ideas in space using marks. And the fact is they can do really well with that. Just briefly here, this Chris Ware's work, is dealing with this sort of sequence. There's a sequence of events, but also, he's very concerned with the sort of side, the tangents, the way our memory is off to the side. And so I think these possibilities of this demonstrate how comics are a profoundly powerful way to represent our thinking. And I can't really stress that enough. They're so powerful at ways to get at thinking that surpass other forms, or at least to tackle it in different ways. But at the same time, they're an incredibly powerful way to generate our thinking. And as somebody who tends to work alone, I always feel like I have a partner in my drawings. I make a mark in my visual system, which is doing all these powerful things all the time to allow us to navigate the world. I sees new things in it. I discover new things in my drawings. And so this is like the first roadmap from unflattening. And it's neat for me because it has Easter eggs in it, that like things that happen, things that don't. And I think it's important to see too, because it's so messy and scrawly that really anybody can do it. But I think what's really important is that it's not a picture of my thinking. This is it. Without this, I don't make that work. Without having the sketches and iterating them and learning from my own marks, I don't make the kind of work I make. And this is true in lots of cases. I picked out one page from the work, which is about Scheherazade and the Arabian Nights stories, where I was talking about the power of stories. And in the middle of the page, I wanted to talk about science, as I've got these other schemes going on with zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. And in wanting to talk about science, I wanted the drawings to like be the right thing. So I had to do all this research to like, what's happening where the Knight's Tales are written down? what's going on then? What's a relevant thing from science? And I stumbled on some work by the man of the name Al-Tusi, working in the Arab Golden Age, who did some work that Copernicus picked up 300 years later to make his big discovery. And I already had this thing about Copernicus, so I was like, this is perfect. So I spent all this time like researching and figuring out how to make it work with my drawings to do what turns out to be this little bit of the page. But the drawings asked me to do that. The drawings asked me to go in directions that I would not have gone without them. And I think as somebody who started this work as a means of making access to ideas through the comics form, what I really found is that it became a different way of thinking for myself. And I see this in my students. And I think we tend to think of thinking as this sort of static activity. But I think, I'm quoting Maxine Sheets Johnstone here, movement is our original mode of thinking, that we think in movement. Things don't just pop out of our heads. Things come from experience. And I like this from Linda Berry. In motion, you speak the language that language is based on. When we move, whether that's moving our bodies or moving our hands to make marks, we find new ways to think and new ways to ask questions. So for me, this process of making these kind of maps, these sketches, and making them, often drawing them badly lets me see new things in my drawings that I wouldn't have seen before because they're sloppy. And so I'm discovering. So for me, drawing is a process always of discovering and always sort of teaching me where I want to go with my work. And so I want to shift with that to sort of wind down here to talk about my students. And I now run a comics program, but traditionally my students have been people who are interested in comics, but maybe have zero experience with them and tend to have zero experience with drawing. I have a few more self-selected ones now that do. But I've been teaching these classes since I was a doc student, and now I have my own program at San Francisco State. How I approach this starts from the start by making my materials. All my syllabi are visual syllabi, a little wordy, but visual syllabi, so that from the start they're sort of seeing this is going to be a different way to approach things. And I ground all the courses in play. We will study and we will play, and we will see that those activities aren't so different. And I think reminding students of how much play is a way they learned and is probably the best way they learned is integral to my classes. So even in my classes that aren't focused on making, we make from the start. We make things from the very start. And I'll show you, and if we had more time, I would do this, and I had some interaction with you all right now, I would do this activity with you, but it's all on my website. This is an activity called Grids and Gestures that I do that it takes about 7 minutes. And I get people thinking about how to organize the experiences of their day across a single sheet of paper. And they animate it with marks and lines and dots and whatever sorts of things they want to do, which gets them very quickly thinking about how you might organize a comics page, how much you might think about time, and how much you know about what marks mean. For instance, a sort of soft curve means something happy. This kind of mark means something angry. Something about stronger lines or firmer lines. And I even have students do things like, what do they look like as a line? Or how could they tell their story as a line? So we get them from the start thinking about how much they already know and how much they know about drawing, even if they don't have any technical experience. And I push from that. I get them thinking about how can they make lifelike things? And it's not all that hard, right? Like the way our eyes work, the way our visual system is, we want to see eyes. We want to see faces in things that don't have them. We want to there's nothing simpler than Peppa Pig, right? There's no cartoon that could be drawn much simpler than that. And yet we relate to that. So we play with things, and I teach them how much just the act of making an eyebrow, and this is borrowed from Ivan Brunetti's book, just the act of adding an eyebrow to this ridiculously simple shape can all of a sudden bring something to life. I show them a bunch of ways of drawing simple figures, borrowing from Linda Berry and others. And we do other things that we get them drawing from the start. Sketch notes, which is a way of note-taking coined by Mike Rohde, but there's other versions of it, where you get them thinking about how to make ideas and not worry about making art. So they take notes in class. They take notes on reading by drawing. And I find even students who don't love it so much, which many of them do, they find both they practice drawing, but they find they remember things better because we remember things from the act of moving. We remember things from what we see. So that's sort of a heart of things. I have them copy. In my intro class, they copy like every author that we read. We're like, well, let's draw ourselves in the style of that. I think we're in a culture that sort of frowns on copying, but there's so much evidence that that's how we learn. My advanced classes, I have them pick pick 3 muses that they copy how they draw water, they copy how they draw panel borders, whatever it is. They start to make that part of theirs and realize that they can make their hands do their own movement. And I think the key in all of it is getting people to play, getting them to play. Whether it's really small things. In a class I taught with Frederick Kohler, we used note cards. So they had 5 minutes at the end of every class. We'd give them some prompt and they'd play with time on a comics page, or they'd play with simultaneity across panels, or some concept that we've been talking about. They'd play with it, or they'd copy, or they'd try whatever they would do. I do an enormous amount with constraints. Things like, how did you get here? Tell that story in 3 panels. Tell that same story in 2 pages. There's all kinds of activities. And I think what I really see in my teaching is that I give the students will teach themselves. You give them things to try and you make it play. They teach themselves the same way that kids learn to do the monkey bars. They watch others, they learn from others, they try things, they play, and they have fun. And we also do enormous amounts of collaboration, which the last 2 years have been really hard since my classes have all been virtual. But the act of sort of, I make something on your page and then hand it to you, sort of frees you of the pressure of having to come up with your own things and liberates you to play. So I want to close here with 2 examples of my student work, and this will be the end. I often make these talks about my work and how it's a legitimate form of scholarship, and people say, I agree with you, but I don't draw. And what I like these 2 students' work, the second one I've showed probably 1,000 times, is that I think I come back to Seth's quote about graphic design and poetry. Like, understanding how to organize space and organize your thoughts in space is really what's key here. The skill in drawing a nose is a lot less important. So this student was a non-drawer, didn't really interested in drawing, but he made for his final project, after we'd done all these quick exercises throughout the semester, he made this comic about not knowing his grandmother who died of Alzheimer's. And you can see he doesn't even bother drawing a nose in any of them, so that's part of it. He learned things. We read epileptic, and we read some graphic medicine things. So you can see little things that he learned from class. But I want to focus on these 3 panels. He's got a blank panel here. I didn't know my grandma. I was told about her. This person no longer existed, and then she was nobody. So the fact that he just used the negative space with this grid he's constructed to say so much meaning. And that's the power of comics. So the final example, this was Odessa. She's a very shy student. Again, not a trained drawer, but this is one of the most profound pieces. And this is just an excerpt from her final. And she says these negative words that she's holding up here. And sometimes she could feel the weight of the words on her shoulders. And then there's this sun sort of emanating positive words, but she is strong. And she played with panels in the ways that I sort of quickly took us through. She got really interested in that. This is a story about a girl who couldn't fit in a box, and they laughed from their boxes that fit as she contorted and twisted, unable to find a place. And finally, so she makes her own box out of words, sounds, and pictures, and soon she learns that there is no need for borders, that boxes restrict her unnecessarily, since she can go anywhere she wishes. And I mean, I've read this again, like probably 1,000 times, and I want to tear up almost every time. Like, what she understood about her thinking and how to express it and how to move us, literally move us, is phenomenal to me. And really demonstrates how much we understand about drawing, about composing on the comics page, even if the kinds of things we think about it, the illustration skills aren't there and aren't even necessary to do that. She understood what comics could do, but that's where it stayed. And so, I have tons of resources on my site. I put all my exercises and class notes and everything, so you're welcome to borrow them, make them your own, use them. But that's the end of the talk part, and I'll take questions. So thank you all so much. How do I stop?
This was amazing, Nick. That stuff you were showing, and I have to ask you, how do the students get into your classes? They're like, is this a general ed class, or are these like visual arts majors? How do they get into your class?
No, it's I'm in a school of humanities and liberal studies. So these are potential teachers. These are a creative writing. I get students from across campus. Now that we have we have making courses, they tend to come more from animation or design or creative writing. But I would still, even in those courses, I would say it's only 1/3 of them that are sort of experienced drawers. But all my classes before, you get 1 or 2 of them that come with experience. The rest of them are just, and I'll say too, I mean, I obviously like trained drawers because there's things they can do that the inexperienced ones can't. But often the inexperienced drawer, and I can say this about myself too, is they don't have any habits to like get stuck on. They don't like, it's hard for me to not draw like I draw. And whereas a person who's brand new to it just is like soaking it all in, and they're just like, whatever, I'm going to try something. And so, yeah, I mean, my classes, they're open to anyone. And that was always important to me. I think, I think comics as a thing, comics as a form of literacy excites me more than comics as a technique. At least as an educator, it does.
Here's a similar question from Kate. I'm going to post it. Can you explain more about your program? Is there a degree or a major or minor?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a minor right now. We're actually maybe going to expand it. You got to have more faculty for that. But it's a minor. It's very small, just 4 courses, and some students are a little more focused. I think more of them that get the minor tend to take the making courses just because there's a sequence of those. But we have an introductory course that we read about 8 different major readings, and I spend a little bit of time on theory, on history, a bunch of time on theory, and integrate that through all the classes. And I try to give them a sampling of everything from graphic medicine, we do have some courses on campus that came out of other programs that are specifically devoted to that. And I think that is one of the most powerful things going now, because, students relate to it immediately. They think about mental health or, physical health, and they connect very quickly, and they can find their own way into it. But we'll read a superhero text, we'll read a memoir, we'll try to show them what comics can be, because many of them come in thinking, they know Marvel movies. That's the extent to it. And we try to think about things like, if you're going to teach this stuff, how do you teach it in your classroom? How do you make that? Yeah.
Here's a question from Greg. I'm often frustrated that despite the wealth of evidence that comics have so much educational value, many people still can't look past the social stigma. How do you address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, well, I'll tell you one simple thing we do in class, and it's funny. We have this midterm in my intro class. It's a take-home thing, and they get to make comics for it, and it's not midterm is kind of a scary word, but it's not in this case. But one of the things I have them do is write a letter to either an administrator, a former teacher, a parent, to say who frowned on them making comics, and I often think, oh, this assignment is starting to be outdated because we've accepted comics. But then there is that story comes out that a librarian or a teacher or somebody said, well, now we want you to do real reading. And I think things I try to teach them in class is, like, comics are hard to read, right? Like, they're easier on some level. There's less words, there's pictures to help you, but they're harder. They're harder in that you have to pay attention to so much. And I tell the story of my daughter reading we read comics since she was like 2.5 together. And I remember she was a very early reader, but this is maybe 3.5, like just before she could read. And I would miss things on the page. Like, I'd miss the sound effect, or I'd miss, and because she had to pay attention so much, if I was reading a word book to her, she could just, sleep or close her eyes or something. But with comic books, she had to know what everything was. So it really forces you to pay attention in a way that's dramatically different, I think, than other kinds of reading. And so that, I mean, there's a lot to say. That's a huge question, but those are some of the things I do.
Great. Here's another question from Graham.
Okay.
Is there a balance between conveying info and formal innovation? I feel like sometimes I get bogged down interpreting comics language at the expense of understanding the message.
I mean, I think it's a good question. I think it's a really subjective one. I mean, I tend to make comics that that are formally complicated because that's just how I go. And I think it's just what I enjoy personally, and I like comics that you can read and read again and discover something new each time. But you know, other people like comics where it's a little more straightforward and it's fairly clear where to read, and it's fairly. I think clarity of reading is always important. I say this as somebody who makes these things that move around a lot. Like I spend an enormous amount of time thinking about how the reader is going to encounter that. So I think it's a great question. It's a longer. I don't know how to answer it besides saying I think you know, not every comic works for every person too, right? You know, I think there are things that will some people respond to really well, and others won't. And I think the beauty of comics, especially today, is there's so much. You know, it's kind of funny to call your class, which I don't right now, but understanding comics. Because like if you said, let's have a class called understanding books, you'd be like, well, that's ridiculous. Like books are this big thing, but comics are this big thing. And that they're everything from stick figure comics to lushly illustrated comics to super wordy comics to wordless comics and all the things that are possible in between. Thank you.
Speaking of which, here's a question. Have you read Scott McCloud's Reinventing Comics? Do you have any thoughts of McCloud's ideas of the future of comics? Matt Madden also explores poetry conventions, exploring constraints in comics.
Well, first, of course, I've read Scott McCloud's Reinventing Comics. I have less. You know, that's of Scott's wonderful books. Sorry, Scott. That's the one I've read the least, especially in recent years. You know, things about the infinite canvas and I'm those are all interesting. You know, the future of comics. I'll say I feel a little curmudgeon-y in this point, in that I'm so interested in what a static page can do for us, and with the possibilities. And there's so much that I sometimes worry that we're hitting this moment where digital is going so fast, and there's so many like things that like move and talk to you, that maybe as comics are finally being recognized for all they can do, we might get missed. But so I won't say much to that. But Matt Madden, I use Matt's book, which what it was in my slides, but I was trying to cut down so I could actually say all that. But I can't, you know, besides recommending Understanding Comics and Making Comics from McCloud, Matt's 99 Ways to Tell a Story is a staple of my intro making course. And what's brilliant about it, for those who don't know, is that Matt tells the most boring one-page story in the history of stories. And then he does it 98 more times, messing with style, messing with form, messing with a different constraint for each thing. And I have my students, we read it and then we add a page to it, like of our own constraint. It was in my slides last night, but it was too long. And then we do our own version of it, where they like tell a boring story and then try their own versions of it. So I think the beauty of that approach to it is that you teach yourself, is that you say, well, how do I tell a story? You know, like, how did I get to class? Or, you know, how did I come to the university, let's just say, and I'm going to do it in 3 panels. So what are 3 things I want to talk about? Well, now ask the same question and tell me in 2 pages. And what are the things you're going to do? And now you've done it. So you've got to compare those. And then you've got a classroom of 25 other students, and they've answered that question in a different way. And we all learn from each other. You know, we see, wow, I wouldn't have thought to do that, or I wouldn't have thought to do that. So, you know, I think it's a great question. And that's a great book. Oh, you muted, I think.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's hard to believe that Reinventing Comics is at least 10 years old, maybe even 20, right?
Oh no, it's got to be 20 years old. It's got to be, because Understanding comes out in 93 and Reinventing comes out in between the two. So
right. There was another book around that same time as Understanding Comics called Comics Rebels. Did you ever read that one?
What's the word?
Comics Rebels. And they were interviews with Frank Miller and Scott McCloud and all these people about what they thought the future of comics was like. And it's weird to read it today, considering it was in the 90s, you know. So
yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict the future. I'm staying out of it. I'm staying out of predicting the future.
We have another question from Mary. When you were teaching online, did you come up with a way for students to collaborate on their drawings, online drawing jams, in other words?
That's a great question, Mary. And I'm still teaching online, so I'm open to them. So I shifted some to mostly coming up with sort of crazy constraints that were, like, let's draw 7 panels, and then panel 1, I don't know, think of a setting, and then panel 2, include some object that's in your room. Panel 3, find a text that's on your phone or something and use it as a thing, as part of the dialogue in the thing. And so we did a lot of self collaboration by playing Matt Madden-esque games. But the actual collaboration, I've not tried the online drawing things, because not every student has the same set of tools. So it becomes a technological challenge. We do things like, because I use an online system where the students post their work all the time. They take photos of it and just post it. So we have done things where like we did it a couple of weeks ago in my making course, where one set of students drew a bad composition, just a blank one, but they made it like in ways that the panels just wouldn't make sense. And then they put it up, and then another student would pick one of the, pick somebody else's, and then they would try to solve it by putting word balloons in just the right place so your eye would go in a certain direction, or a character jumping across the screen. So it takes a little bit because you got to redraw the page. So we've done things like that where they put one thing up and the other one takes it down. And I have tried some of my more like I do a great collaborative exercise in person that I really love it, where one student draws the panels and they pass it on, and then the next round you just put words in, so word balloons, sound effects, whatever, and then pass it on, and then the last person has to like figure out what's in the drawings, what to draw. And it's a blast. It's a great thing to end a workshop with, and it's a little tricky to pass it. That the third pass tends to get messy on the computer. But I think there's possibilities, and anybody who's got knows that they're, that the students have similar technology can probably do things where they draw together. But they certainly can talk together and suggest things. But I will say that the in-person collaboration, where like we've done a thing where you guys are probably familiar with Norman Rockwell's got it's a cover where it's called Gossip or Chatter or something like that, where one face.
Yeah, you have all these heads, talking heads, and
there's all these talking heads. And Alison Bechdel did a riff on it in the cover for Things to Watch Out For, and My Little Pony did it too, which is what reminded me, because I read My Little Pony in my house. But we've done it in class where the first person draws their face saying something, and then they pass it to another student, and that person does two, themselves telling, and then it goes around the room till it comes back. Those kinds of things, just fast time and a constraint, it really makes them change how they can do things. It's really exciting. So it's a little trickier online, but we're getting there.
Okay, I'm not sure if I have any more questions, but I'm going to post the link to your website. Can you tell us a little bit about what they can find in this website?
Yeah, I mean, you can find my work, and that's nice. But if you go to the education tab, on the education tab, you can find all my syllabi. Several of my classes, I've documented everything we did in the class. So here's the activity, and here's what students did in it. So I'll post examples of their work. And some of those I'll actually, like my grids and gestures exercise that I talked about briefly, that has its own separate page. So some of the activities are like really blown up into more detail, and some of them you just got to dig around a little bit. And then the rest, there's a ton of other things, everything from comics in the classroom, articles, to things to use in your classroom. There's a ton of links to that. And there's even, I co-organized in the past year 2 symposia on making comics accessible for blind readers, which is something that I make all my work about, the importance of visual thinking, and I'm teaching about visual literacy. and starting to recognize that, this is leaving out a lot of people that are interested in comics that would like to be part of it. So so I've got some resources on that now. Yeah. So there's lots. Oh, you're muted again, I think, or quiet.
Sorry about that. I have another
No.
question from Jan.
Hey, Jan.
Are there specific comics or graphic novels that you would recommend for use in the classroom?
That's I think that's a tough one. The best one, I would ask Sturgios Batzakis. I would post a question to him on Twitter, or he's got a great website where he reviews readings for exactly those ages. And I would look at Sturgios Batzakis. I would look at his list. I can think about things I read with my own kid. Yeah, I think Shaun Tan's The Arrival is a great choice. I've taught that once, and many people teach The Arrival as their first thing in a comics class. It's a wordless book, and I love it. It's a super important book. I tend not to. I teach this one. This is called Robot Dreams by Sarah Varon, for second book, and it's a wordless one as well. But what's stunning about it to me is that it's a book my daughter had read, but I just read it with my 3-year-old boy this week, and then my college students this week at the same time. And I remember before I'd actually taught it, I would bring it to class just to show them what could be done in wordless comics, and students would pick it up, and they would be like enthralled with it. And it's happened every time, but what I think the beauty of it is that you think it's so simple, right? You think, and this maybe comes back to that first or second question. You think it's such a simple thing, and you say, "Oh, that's for kids," and you go to the library to get it. It's in the little kids section. But the reality is, once you start looking at it and start noticing all the subtle things that are going on, and how much emotion she can make you feel through this, and how much complexity of storytelling is, you say, "Wait a second, this is enormous." And Shaun Tan's book, which I love, and it's leans more into the way I make comics, I think he's such a tour de force of drawing skill that it can be a little more intimidating when I'm trying to sneak them into discovering they can draw. That's the only reason I don't start with it, but it's one of the greatest books there is. So,
what do you think of Neil Cohn's theory on comics as a language?
Yeah, that's a longer question than I can answer. I think Neil himself would say comics are not a language and a subset of sort of visual. I think that's his words on it. It's pretty neat. They've done so many. His lab has done so many studies on how meaning is made, and I've read most of it. I don't think I have an ability to respond quickly to that one. But I think it's awesome that it exists. And, if you're interested in thinking of the study of comics in a scientific, formal way, I highly recommend it. And, I think it sparks a lot of thoughts, and definitely something that's always on my reading list as I start to think about new courses and ways to think about comics. So that's my shortest answer I can do.
Here's one from Clayton.
Is there a wide variety of ages? There's really, I have college students, and I get some older college students, but they're 19 to 25, and then I have some, the 40-year-olds or 50, I have some occasional senior students, but I tend to have a little, a little less. Other places I've taught before here, I might have had a bigger mix. I think I don't know. I guess I don't have much more to say about that. I think it's fun to have a wide variety of ages, but it's just not the way our university tends to be.
Well, I think we'll wrap up with that.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Nick. This was
thanks.
Everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was fun, and I like this format with the questions. Thank you all.
Yeah, I'm beginning to really like this platform for doing presentations. I have so much control.
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah.
So let me just turn that off. But before, guys, Nick cannot hear us clapping, so let us give him some nice thank yous in the chat.
Thank you all. I
We
like your
appreciate
questions.
him coming out today.
Yeah, thanks for coming, and be safe, and hopefully someday we'll do these things in person.
And I will be mining your website for content that I can teach in my classes.
Do it. That's what, I mean, I think there's some people who say, why do you put it all out there? But I'm like, the more people teach it well, the better we all are, right? And it's useful. I'm going to put it there for myself anyway, so I might as well share it. Share it.
So as I mentioned before, this is our last presentation for the day. Thank you very much for closing us out. This was really great. But we do have one more event, not necessarily not a presentation, but just a social. So everybody's free to join us at 4 o'clock. Can join us here. It goes on through 5, I think. So, and I would recommend the Chrome browser and not a mobile device to join us there. Okay, well, Nick, thank you very much,
Thanks,
and I do hope we get to collaborate again.
Yeah, I do too.
I'll definitely be emailing you if for any advice on teaching comics.
Cool. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.